Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. For the month of March, we are reading The Mirror and the Light, Hilary Mantel's mammoth historical novel, the third in her sequence of novels about Henry VIII's unscrupulous, low-born leg breaker, Thomas Cromwell, who, in these books, is anything but. He is ruthless when he has to be, but he is a firm believer in the new faith. He is a profound Christian. He believes in the fundamental dignity of the working man. He's generous to a fault. He's open-hearted. His home is open to all. He's, in other words, unrecognizable from what we know from the historical record Thomas Cromwell was like, and yet completely convincing. Mantel creates an alternate Thomas Cromwell who is completely convincing, except when she can't. This is more evident in the second book in this series, Bring Up the Bodies, than it is in this third one. But there are moments when the actual Cromwell crawls across the page of history like a slug, leaving a trail. And if you are a conscientious historical novelist, as Hilary Mantel was, the weather is scarcely out of place in any of these things. If you get a date, you can be sure the weather matches that date. If you're a conscientious historical novelist, well, when you get to those moments, you can't falsify them. And she doesn't. She doesn't falsify them. There are moments when we know that Cromwell was absolutely brutal. There are lots of other moments where we can easily infer brutality, and she doesn't. If there's any wiggle room for her hero, he gets it. And that comes into focus in the pages that we're reading today, because there's a major event that happens in the chapters that we're reading today. I made mention last week of an important thing to remember if you're reading this for the first time, or even if you're rereading it. The arrow flight that gave shape to the first book in this series, Wolf Hall, was a pair of downfalls. A pair of people who rose high and fell. Thomas Wolsey, Archbishop Wolsey, and also Thomas More. remember Kieran's comment that all the characters in this book are called Thomas. They are. You just have to live with that. It's a popular name. So, in that book, we have two downfalls. And that gives, and there's also a rise, of course. There's a rise of Thomas Cromwell. But there's a downfall and then another downfall. And that gives a shape to things. It gives a shape to the narrative. And the same thing is true in Bring Up the Bodies. We have the continued rise of Thomas Cromwell and the downfall of Anne Boleyn. Always with other characters floating around the periphery. We have Thomas Cromwell's son and his nephew and the young men that fill his household, and all the young men that are hangers-on to him from court. As he rises, he gathers these barnacles that want to watch everything that he does. You have that huge cast of characters. You've got all sorts of domestic cast of characters. You've got the people at court and the powerful figures at court. And, of course, the apex of all of that is King Henry VIII. But the downfalls provide a shape. And the reason why the shape is so effective is because in most of those cases, Thomas Cromwell, the character, is not only watching those downfalls, but is manufacturing them. He is arranging downfalls. He arranges the downfall of Thomas More. He arranges the downfall of Anne Boleyn. And in the chapters that we're reading today, he is accused of arranging the downfall of Cardinal Wolsey, the man that we are given to believe in Hilary Mantel's version of Thomas Cromwell is everything: father, uncle, God, father confessor, lord, benefactor, teacher. He's everything. The last thing that Thomas Cromwell would ever do is betray Cardinal Wolsey. Again, I think the historical record makes it very clear that that's exactly what Cromwell did. That when he saw that the ship of Thomas Wolsey was sinking, like a rat, he was the first one out. And turned evidence against Wolsey. I think it's easy to make that claim. Easy to back it up with the documents that we have. But it's not explicit. It's not in black and white. And so Mantel, of course, doesn't do that. She has Wolsey's illegitimate daughter, who's in a convent, accuse Cromwell of betraying Wolsey. And it completely stops him. It completely takes him apart. He cries. His own hangers-on are astonished. They're begging him to stop. Please stop crying. Why are you? We've never seen you cry. Why are you doing this? He he does not see it coming, that accusation, and he cannot imagine it. And later on, when he thinks about it, in the throes of that shock, he realizes that this young girl, she was a child when all this happened. Who could have told her that Cromwell betrayed her father other than her father? So he's presented with the horrible possibility that Wolsey went to his grave thinking that Cromwell had betrayed him. But we'll leave that out. If we say that other men brought about the downfall of Wolsey, and that Cromwell exacts long-term revenge on those other men, if we say that, that is kind of the phantom plot of Bring Up the Bodies, certainly it's true for everybody else that Cromwell is not only watching the arc of their downfall, but that he brings it about, which is going, as I made a point last time saying, that's going to make this book feel a little unformed, a little wandering. Because Cromwell is the main character. Cromwell is everything in this book. We don't know what anybody else is thinking unless they tell Cromwell. We know everything he thinks. He's the main focus in this book, and he's got all sorts of things to do. He's Keeper of the Privy Seal. He's the most important person in the civil government, the king's indispensable right-hand man. He's also vicegerent, so he is the most important man in church matters as well. And that keeps us going, but he's not working a downfall in this book. A downfall is being worked on him. That's the point I was trying to make last time, is that the arc of this book is the downfall of Thomas Cromwell, which of course he's not going to see or have any kind of incremental part in. And that's going to make it possible for you to read this book and think it's a little unfocused, or maybe a lot unfocused given the length. Hilary Mantel gives herself leeway in this book to just write, and it's amazing. I think it's amazing. I could take this to be twice as long. I wanted to offer that as just a preliminary warning that this is going to feel like just a lot of toing and froing. A lot of it is going to feel that way. Some critics thought that, and I could not disagree more. This is what all those other characters thought their lives were going about before their downfall overtook them. The only thing that I would quibble with here is that I would like to have seen more of the shaping of that downfall. Of course, Cromwell doesn't see it, so we don't see it. We get hints of it here and there. Doorways being closed, whispers that stop as soon as Cromwell enters a room. But we don't get the thing itself. And history is silent on the thing itself, so we won't ever know. Instead, what we get in this book is a series of events and themes. And sometimes they come together, and in one way they come together in one of the biggest examples where Mantel cannot get away from the real Cromwell. She wants to get away from the real world, the real historical Cromwell as much as possible in these books, while still making them somehow uncannily accurate. She wants to get away from that historical Cromwell as much as possible. But there's one big event in this book, in the chapters that we're reading today, that she can't get away from, and that is the so-called Pilgrimage of Grace, a gigantic popular uprising against all sorts of things, a whole litany of wrongs in the north of England in 1536. So right at the heart of the story that we're telling now, word starts to come to London, starts to filter into London and Whitehall of an uprising in Lincolnshire. And Henry threatens it and is furious, and that uprising dissipates, and a lot of its orchestrators are brutally murdered, brutally executed by the state. But the seed has already been sown, and the grievances that sparked that first uprising are still there. They're getting worse. So that gives rise to an uprising called the Pilgrimage of Grace, which is much, much bigger. I won't call them pilgrims, but the rebels in this uprising have a whole list of grievances. They don't like the fact that Cromwell's new court of augmentations under Sir Richard Rich are closing a lot of the smaller monasteries and religious houses. They don't like that. They don't like the fact that a lot of the pretty plates and ornaments are being taken from those houses and confiscated by the state. And they don't like a key thing here that is underscored, that is underplayed in a lot of accounts of the Pilgrimage of Grace. They don't like the idea of taxation during peacetime. Henry has given them years and years of peace, and they don't see why they should be facing taxes at all, much less onerous taxes, when they're not raising armies. But they also have another complaint. Several of their complaints are religious. They don't like the new religion. They don't like the new reform. They want the old ways back. They want the old Catholic ceremonies back. They want their saints and holy men back, their relics back, the pretty things in their churches and whatnot back. But there's another thing that they don't like, and they name it specifically. The Lincolnshire Uprising named it, and the Pilgrimage of Grace names it. And that thing is Thomas Cromwell. They don't like the fact that the king has mean men, or as our chapters say it, vile blood, around him. They're okay being ruled by their betters, but they don't want to be ruled by some jumped up blacksmith's son from Putney. They're sure that a lot of the ills that are facing them, the enclosure of common grounds, the increase in taxes, the increase in duties, the stripping of their own altars, they're sure that a lot of those ills must be coming. They can't be coming from the king. The Lincolnshire Uprising was fundamentally loyal to Henry. And the Pilgrimage of Grace is fundamentally loyal to Henry. They love him. It can't be coming from him. It has to be coming from these new men that he has around them, and they want them gone. They want them not only gone, but punished. There's no way for Mantell to avoid that. As word trickles in, we're with Cromwell. So she can't go up to 30,000 fleet, float over to Louth or Hull, and plunk down in the camps of Robert Aske or any of these religious rebels. She can't do that. So we get the word as they get it. But they get word that this uprising is enormous. 30, 40,000 people. We always think about medieval and late medieval kings as having standing armies and the halberders with the visors and whatnot. But Henry couldn't field a tenth of that. On short notice or even on long notice, he couldn't field a tenth of that. The key thing to realize about the Pilgrimage of Grace is that if it had been effectively organized, it would have unseated the government. It was easily big enough to do that, easily powerful enough to do that. All the bluster that Henry had towards the preliminary first uprising in Lincolnshire would not have worked at all with the Pilgrimage of Grace, and he knows that. He sees that right away. The more reports Cromwell gets from his agents in the field, the more he realizes bluster won't work here. We have to try something else. We have to be conciliatory, at least at first, until we can figure out what to do. We see the panic in London. We see the melting down of the king's jewel or the king's plate and into armor and coins. We see the selling of jewels to armorers in the city who want cash on the barrelhead. We see the mustering of arms and realize this late feudal aspect of England. We realize why these incredibly powerful magnates, the Earl of Derby, the Duke of Suffolk, the Duke of Norfolk, we understand now why they are such proud, weird, quasi-monarchical men. Because when push comes to shove, they can raise private armies at the service of the king, or maybe not. It's always an awkward dance that you have to do with these overmighty subjects. Cromwell, of course, can't raise an army. He has money and a huge amount of influence, more than anyone, but he doesn't have a history. Keep in mind, he just has a past. He sends his cooks into the field and buys armory and what he can. He does what he can. As Henry gets ready to deal with the Pilgrimage of Grace. Of course, at the moment that we're in this novel where we're reading it, the Duke of Norfolk, the greatest noble in the land, is on the outs with Henry. Henry's in a snit with him, doesn't like him, doesn't want to see him, doesn't want him nearby, and at first doesn't want him to participate in putting down these rebels. Of course, Norfolk is bloodthirsty to get at them. When he does, though, when he finally is allowed out of his kennel to go up north and face these rebels, he realizes right away that they'll overwhelm him. If his response to them is simple belligerence, they'll overwhelm him. So he has to treat with them. The idea is that you will wait them out, because we have, as this book says, more subtle arguments and better guns. We just have to wait them out. A lot of these people are husbands from home. They're farmers from field. They can't stay encamped around Hull. They will eventually have to fritter away, and then we'll be able to deal with them. Henry has the masterstroke. In the real history, it was Henry's idea. In this book, it's Cromwell's idea that he has Henry announce, is that he will invite the leader of these rebels, Robert Aske, to come to him for a talk, and that will help to defang the whole thing. And it does. It works very well. But that's one of the big things that happens in this book. And I could understand where, if you were reading this, you might be thinking, well, okay, but the trilogy isn't about the Pilgrimage of Grace. The book isn't even about the Pilgrimage of Grace, so why am I reading this exactly? Well, I mean, it's well written, it's beautifully written, but why am I reading about this? Social unrest, religious unrest, why am I reading about any of this? Well, the reason you're reading about it is because it's what was occupying Thomas Cromwell while his own downfall was coming his way. We just have to live with that in this book. We're not going to get the arrow arc of the earlier two books because that arrow arc is happening to our point of view character. I myself don't have much objection. I love all the talk in here about the new religious ways, the reform of the church, the fact that that would fuel a rebellion. We actually get a scene at the beginning of the chapters that we're reading today. A character named Robert Barnes, who has disappeared, reappears in England. He is a religious reformer. He has been on the continent working for Cromwell, who in Hilary Mantel's version is an ardent religious reformer, as ardent as he can be. He doesn't want to push things with the king. And the king is feeling his way on where he stands with any religious reform of any kind in the church or Martin Luther or any of it. But at one point, when Father Barnes has returned to Cromwell and they're talking, we get a natural flashback to his first encounter with Cromwell when Cromwell was just a thug of Thomas Wolsey. And we get a wonderful exchange here that reminds you of the simplicity of what should have been at stake. Of course, it could never happen this way, but this is an interaction between Wolsey in the past. Wolsey's long dead when this book starts, but we get flashbacks of him a couple of times. Outside, a bell pierces frozen air. A man comes in with a tray of spiced wine. The cardinal pours it himself from a jug gaudily enameled with a Tudor rose. So what do you want me to do, Barnes? You want me to leave off the state and ceremony which honors God and go in homespun? You want me to keep a miser's table and serve peas pudding to ambassadors? You want me to melt down my silver crosses and give the money to the poor which will piss it against a wall? Then we get this wonderful bit. There is a pause. After a time, faintly, Barnes says, yes. Yes, I do want you to do that, because that is what a Christian would do. That is Christianity. Of course, you are not a Christian. You are a potentate. And we get a lot of that in these chapters, too. Not with Wolsey, because he's long gone, but we get one of the most fascinating threads running through all three of these books. A thread that I would bring up if I were proctoring a book club in person, if I were hosting this book club here at Hyde Cottage with wine and calzones every Friday, or every weekend. How much would I love that? How much fun would that be? I would bring up, when I've done that in the past, you don't want to be heavy-handed in a book club, but you do want to push things along. Especially if it's a book that you know a lot better than the other people in the club. You want to come up with questions to get conversation started, but don't be doctrinaire. Don't stick to your question. Follow the conversation where it goes. But if I were doing that, one of the questions that I would come up with here for these chapters especially would be, what are we seeing from Henry? What is Hilary Mantel's portrait of Henry? Far too often in Tudor fiction, Henry is just an ogre, a non-human ogre. And in Wolf Hall, he is largely a non-human ogre. There's a more nuanced portrait of him here, all throughout this book, where we see him shaken by dreams, visited by the ghosts of his dead brother, his father, that he assures Cromwell, my father must be watching me. As much as possible, Hilary Mantel tries to give us an insight into what would make Henry what he is. Of course, at this point in the story, he has exiled his rightful queen and executed his second wife. So there's something that does feel slightly inhuman about him, or maybe more than slightly inhuman about him. And we get a passage about that, about what would contribute to that. We saw something of it last time, but that passage about the land, the very soil of England being silted with ghosts and echoes in the grass. But here we get about princes. There are references a couple of times in these chapters. Cromwell mentions a couple of times an Italian named Niccolo who has written a book about princes. And it's not yet translated into English, but maybe he thinks it'll be a hit. When it is, of course, that's Machiavelli. But we get a passage here. I love a lot of these passages. They're very self-indulgent, but I love them anyway. You think of the prince as living on an exalted plane, finer and higher than other men. But perhaps Gregory has a point. Is a prince even human? If you add him up, does the total make a man? He is made of shards and broken fragments of the past, of prophecies and of the dreams of his ancestral line. The tides of history break inside him. Their current threatens to carry him away. His blood is not his own, but ancient blood. His dreams are not his own, but the dreams of all England. The dark forest, the deserted heath, the stir of the leaves, the dragon's footprint, the hand breaking the waters of a lake. In other words, Excalibur. His forefathers interrupt his sleep to castigate, to warn, to shake their heads in mute disappointment. At a prince's coronation, God transfigures him. His human faults falling away, his human capacities increased, but that burst of light has to last him. That instant's transfusion of grace must sustain him for 30 years, 40 years, for the rest of his mortal life. It's an attempt, anyway, to give us at least an insight into what makes Henry himself. The ghost stalking all of those attempts to humanize Henry is that we know what he's going to do to Thomas Cromwell. He's going to have Cromwell killed. So the closer he gets to Cromwell in these chapters, the worse that is. The sharper that is. Cromwell is literally writing a book called The Book of Henry about how to deal with Henry. This particular Henry. We get little excerpts from it. Do not turn your back on the king. This is not merely a matter of protocol. We get little excerpts from it. Surely, we think, if the king loves him so much that at one point in an earlier council meeting we saw, he blurts out, well, if I choose to make a commoner from Putney my foremost counselor, I will do so. And if Thomas Cromwell's descendants rule this land after me, I will come back from my grave and ask why if anyone questions it. The whole council room falls into deadly silence. The king has all but named Cromwell or his son as successors to the throne. That degree of closeness you'd like to think would last. We get a scene, the last thing I'll read you here that is just heartbreaking. There's one point where the king can't have enough of Thomas Cromwell. The king does not want to be without Cromwell, as the mornings grow misty and the first chill lies on the air. Come be near me, he says. Spend your days with me. Maybe just to keep the rules, sleep under another roof at night. He obeys. He makes sure to talk every day about young Sadler, how he misses the light of the king's countenance. He writes to Edward that his visit to Wolf Hall will have to wait. The king calls him Tom Cromwell. He calls him Crum. He walks through the garden at Esher, his arm about his counselor's neck, and says, I have hopes of this child. If I could have 3 wishes, like a man in a tale, I would wish for a prince, bonny and well-doing. I would wish for myself to live long enough to guide him to man's estate. Do you think you will make old bones, Crum? And Cromwell says, I don't know. I have a fever I brought home from Italy. They say it weakens the heart. But of course the thing that's going to kill him is Henry. And we know this. When we're reading scenes like that, we know this. The boy that Henry is mentioning there is the other big thing. One of the 2 other big things that happens in the chapters that we're reading today. Jane Seymour gives Henry what he has always wanted, a legitimate male heir who lives. It's curiously muted, the way it's done. There's a lot more fanfare about Anne Boleyn's first miscarriage in Bring Up the Bodies than there is about Edward's birth. But there it is. We watch Jane Seymour get pregnant, assure her brothers that she is pregnant, finally give birth after an agonizing 3 or 4 days. And then Henry has a son. And there's rejoicing all throughout the land. And Henry feels 10 times bigger. And then Jane dies. Right after giving birth, she dies. All sorts of medical speculation, some of it very interesting, about whether or not this might actually be Henry's fault. whether or not the deaths and the stillborn arrivals and so many of his children, and also the death of his wife after childbirth might be his fault. All kinds of complex medical speculation. It doesn't work its way into our read of this book, but it's so interesting to read scientific speculation about precisely why Henry VIII of England was so unable to produce offspring. Why was that so? When children are left on doorsteps as surplus because it's so easy to do at this age or any other age. Those events end out the chapters that we're reading today. The birth of an heir and the death of Jane Seymour. This is a big deal. Cromwell has intertwined his family with the Seymours to a great extent. He has expected them to be the first family in the land for a long time. He has expected Jane Seymour to go into childbirth several times. The Seymour brothers, Thomas and Edward, expect very much that they will be the first family in the land for a long time. All of a sudden, that's over. It would have been endangered if Jane had delivered a girl, but here it's much worse. Here it's that she delivers a boy and then dies, so the Seymour family is gone. They don't know what's going to happen, and we don't either. We're poised on the brink of that here. We get several stirring moments in these chapters with Princess Mary, Henry's only surviving child, with his actual wife, Catherine of Aragon. She's a wonderful character in here. Little Eliza, the little Princess Elizabeth, is too young to be a figure in this story, in these chapters. But that's where we'll leave off for today. The Pilgrimage of Grace happens. It threatens London. It threatens Henry's rule. If 40,000 men marched on London, they could pull Henry and Cromwell out of the Tower of London, out of anywhere, out of any bolt hole. They just don't. Norfolk goes to treat with them and waits them out. And once they start to fritter away, they are brutally executed. Brutally. Of course, the punishment here, they're all commoners. The punishment here is to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, which is horrifying. It's much, much worse than the fate that finally befalls William Tyndale. In these chapters, we finally get definitive word that Tyndale is dead on the continent. He was also burned, but he was strangled at the stake, so we're not 100% sure. Cromwell gets an account that says that he lived. Sometimes victims who are going to be burned to death, a man would stand behind them with a hawser and strangle them to death, so it's just their body that's burned. Cromwell is told that in Tyndale's case that wasn't true. He was partially strangled, but he was very much alive and when he was being burned. We don't know if that's true or not, but that happens off stage. Anyway, a lot of things happen off stage just persistently here, and we have to hear rumors of them because we only know them through Cromwell. We're not moving to them. So the scheming of Reginald Pole on the continent, we only have to hear about it. We don't know what's happening. The scheming of Lord Lisle and his wife over in Calais, we can read about that all we want in the Lisle letters, but we can't read about it here. We only get what Cromwell's informants can tell him. And also offstage, the death of Erasmus and the death of Tyndale. So those are the chapters that we're reading today for The Mirror and the Light. Fascinating portraits of Henry in crisis, with disappointment and also with the greatest joy of his life. All sorts of great toss-away lines here, but those are the chapters that we're doing now. So we are going to move on next time. I don't know how that's going to be disrupted by my altered week next week, but I'll hope to stick to the schedule. So we ended here with the end of part 3. And for next time, we're just going to do part 4. We're just going to do 100 pages for part 4. So that's just from in this Indian subcontinent edition, that would be from page 523 to page 619. From the chapter, part 4, number 1 is Nonsuch, which is the winter that crosses over from 1536 to 1538, 1537 to 1538. Then Corpus Christi, which is June to December of 1538, almost the whole year. And then Inheritance, which is the end of 1538. So we'll be reading just chapter 4, part 4 next time, and then we'll finish up with parts 5 and part 6 to finish up the book. But that's not until next weekend, if then. We'll see. We'll see how much my schedule will be disrupted. But I definitely wanted to continue with this. I'm hoping you're all enjoying it. I'm loving this read-through. And this ornate trade paperback is holding up fairly well. So that's great. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.